Nancy, hello, good morning. You are listening to Research DEcolonized. We've taken a little break, but we're back with an exciting episode here with Spencer Greening. So, Spencer, do you want to introduce yourself with as little or much detail as you want? Like where you're from, community, where you work, areas of research, all that fun stuff. And thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Laura. So as mentioned, my name is Spencer Greening. I'm from the Tsimshian or Tsimshian people of the Northwest Coast. My Tsimshian name is Lagod, and I come from the Gitgata tribe or village or nation, however you want to look at it, also known as the Gitgat First Nation. And I've been doing research with my own community for quite a few years now. Right now, I'm currently a PhD candidate at Simon Fraser University, and I'm in interdisciplinary studies. In my whole sort of academic career, I've dabbled in an array of social sciences, but all surrounding Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous governance, traditional ecological knowledge, and more recently, I'm really starting to focus my research on human, non-human relationships with ecosystems, Indigenous ecological law, anything I can do where I can talk about hunting, harvesting, fishing, that sort of thing, because that's my jam.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And I actually said this, I think, to Rihanna Robinson, but I'm going to say it again to you. So you've decided to pursue a PhD, which is crazy. And I admire that because basically you're writing a book. And then funny enough, I think you're going to talk about the fact that you're actually writing a book. So that will be good.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about what led you to embark on this humongous journey, like bachelor's, master's, PhD, postdoc, etc., and why you chose to be in the programs you've chosen?
Yeah, I mean, the story is actually kind of wild, Laura, in that it starts from when I was a teenager and I got into death metal music. And so me and my cousin were playing in a death metal band, and we just something inside us wanted to talk and tell stories about our culture. And so those who know metal, it's like very extreme stories are told in that music genre. So we write songs about war and mysticism and spirituality, and we would get political about decolonization and all this stuff. And so by the time we were like 18, we were asking our elders a lot of questions, and it just ignited this connection around culture. And there's this whole wild story about our music career that is, it's just a whole nother bag. And but long story short, it created this path really where those conversations with elders surrounding art led to more conversations. When I say art, I mean story, expression, songs. And I think within any Indigenous culture, you learn that when you discuss stories, songs, history, any of these things, politics, you get involved in community and knowledge systems in a very holistic way. And so as I learned more, I almost became more consumed with community responsibilities, with cultural responsibilities within our traditional hereditary system, within just day-to-day stuff, within harvesting, and my relationships with elders and wanting to learn as much as I could about the culture. So while all that was happening, I was doing my undergrad in Indigenous studies, political science, history, kind of a mixed bag. Originally, I wanted to be a high school teacher or something, long time ago. And I remember as I finished my undergrad, I didn't even realize that there were anthropologists who had come and worked with our people and recorded these histories that I had only heard my elders talk about. And there was this conversation of why aren't there Indigenous anthropologists? Or if they are, where are they? And how do I learn about this? And how do I sort of do this for my own community? It embarked me on another journey of doing my master's thesis, of talking about traditional systems of governance, really taking a deep dive into our hereditary system, our traditional governance system, and what law, politics, roles are in that world. And so my master's thesis actually was more about cross village connections and responsibilities politically, and how that is kind of dichotomized with the Indian Act and the reserve system. And how growing up, I thought I was just from Hartley Bay, the Gitga'at First Nation. I didn't realize I was in this web of interconnected villages based on my clan, my lineage, and all these other details that you learn about when you learn about these traditional governance systems. From there, I was engaged, I started getting more engaged with politics. And as you're in the hereditary system on the coast, it's hugely implicated in ongoing decisions on the ground in kind of the world, the global political world. So while this was happening, the village of Hartley Bay was engaged in a court case against the Northern Gateway pipeline, the Enbridge pipeline. And so as my music was phasing out, I was kind of involved in research surrounding that, working with lawyers. And somewhere around that time, I was also encouraged by my elders in the community to run for council, and I was elected on council. And so I served on council during this court case, but also there was this new LNG explosion on the coast where we were dealing with like 5 proponents directly in our area, 5 to 7, I think, and then 12 different projects. And it was just an insane time politically on the Northwest coast. And so between finishing up the master's thesis, doing cultural legal research for my village, and being on council with all the other day-to-day stuff that happens in council on top of these court cases, I was super burnt out. And I ended up working with Nancy Turner and Dana Leposki, Dana being now my supervisor, on some cultural stuff. And they pulled me aside and said, "Hey, Spencer, you seem pretty burnt out from politics. Why don't you take a little vacation and do a PhD?" And that's where we get to today. We're 6 years, almost 6 years down the road, and I'm getting close to finishing the PhD. With the first semester being totally chaotic, where I was still on council, still doing research, still defending my master's and my PhD coursework, all in the first year.
Yeah, for the listeners, I laughed so much at that little break. Why don't you do a PhD? That's absurd. That's amazing. Like, it's so cool to see how involved you've been with your own community and how your research has like followed and coupled and perhaps like supported, enhanced that for your community. I have a couple little like follow-up questions on that. So you did grow up in community, as you said. Like, were you raised really traditionally, or what led you to this kind of like, let's hook up with the elders and see what's going on?
Great question. And I'm glad you brought this up. To clarify, I wasn't raised in my community. I was raised a few hours in the interior in a small town called Burns Lake.
Okay, awesome.
And from the interior of Prince Rupert. And so my mom worked with the Lake Babine Nation. And so growing up, I went to school on the res there as a child, and I remember being quite confused on, somehow I knew I was in Lake Babine, but I went to school with all the Lake Babine kids, but I knew my family was in Rupert, but I was very confused. So I was involved in, like, my childhood best friends were Wet'suwet'en from Lake Babine, and so it was a little confusing. But then as I got older, I was able to figure it out. And it was just first going to my grandfather and just asking questions as a teenager and being really interested, as I mentioned, because of music and the stories I wanted to tell through music. And then from there, when I would go to Rupert in my late teens, he would just invite me along to all the things, which turned into just dinners with all the other fluent speaking elders and hanging out with them, to the political events where it's like clan meetings, hereditary business. And then through that process, you slowly get sort of groomed into these roles where you start speaking on behalf of elders and start getting involved in these ways. So that's kind of just how it happened. But the first time I visited my community, it was in my late teens. First time I visited Hartley Bay. It was funny because me and my cousin, his name's Jeremy Paul, and he also goes by Saltwater Hank these days. He's a folk musician now. We were both still really into our metal, and so we showed up in like leather jackets with this elder who I adore, but is also known as one of the crankier elders in the village. And so the people were like running around, like gossiping as they would on the res, and they're like, "Holy shit, he brought the Hells Angels into the village." They had no idea that we were their cousins. So we showed up in these leather jackets on the fishing boat, and they thought some wild deal was going down because these long-haired dudes in leather jackets just showed up in the village with this it's elder with a temper.
Oh my gosh. That's so intense. I love that. I love that for you. Can I ask sidebar, what did you do in your band? Did you sing? Did you play guitar? What did you do
I was
specifically?
um so I was the drummer primarily. And so my cousin and I were the primary sort of idea people in writing this stuff. And I started out in other roles years ago, but I was the drummer for most of the time.
That's super cool. Oh my gosh. So again, another big curve change. I just keep throwing these from like different ends of the field, right? So, out of curiosity, and you kind of talked about this just briefly. So when you were doing this research on your traditional hereditary system and those rules and laws, etc. And again, I don't know if you can talk about this, so let me know if you can't. What does that look like in your community with the same kind of structure going on at the same time implemented by like the Indian Act with band councils and stuff? Like, is it a big are they in conflict with each other? Do they complement each other? What does that look like?
Yeah, this is a great question. Luckily for Hartley Bay, right now our hereditary system and elected leadership are very closely intertwined. And this isn't the case for every nation, where you can see in many places, given court cases and everything that's arisen through Indigenous politics and land title, where hereditary systems have the rights to the lands or have the non-extinguished rights to these lands, as shown in Delgamuukw or the Calder case or all these old cases. And yet the Indian Act Band Council is this elected piece that sort of just acts really more like a municipality. But it's also very confusing because at least in Hartley Bay, which is a very remote community, when I was on council, not only are you looking after sewage and housing and all that stuff, you're dealing with giant corporations and you're dealing with social work, and you're also the sheriff and the cop of the town because there's no cops. So at 3 a.m., if there's a fight, a council member is called to come break up the party in the fight. And so it's like this really weird job in politics that no one else would have other than an Indigenous community. Anyways, in our case, we recognize that under our traditional law, having an elected band council overstep the hereditary system in making decisions on our ecosystem, on our environment, any land-based decisions or water. When I say land-based or whatever, I'm generally speaking to the territory. And so we passed a bylaw, in a sense, that stated that any land-based decision making, any stewardship-based decision making, the hereditary governance leaders, the chiefs, have veto power. And so anything that comes up in our territory, we forward it to them and say, hey, we'll work with our consultants and our lawyers and all this stuff, and we'll report back to you. But if you disagree with what we're doing, let us know and you can like straighten us out. Not the case in a lot of bands where you get internal conflict. And it's really this sort of ego match, in my opinion. It's probably more complex and I'm generalizing, but in my opinion, it's our elected band councils just willing to hand over that power. And there's probably nuance, like how intact is the hereditary system and how many representatives are there? Do they still believe in it? And how do we move forward if that's not intact? And so that's the nuance that, we're privileged we don't have to deal with because our hereditary system is quite strong. But yeah, that's the gist of it, and that's how we've worked around it. And I see other nations doing it, but it at the time when we did it like 10 years ago, it was a big deal for us and our neighbors to see that happening.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I was going to say, and of course, I am not an expert by any means. That's my disclaimer on traditional governments to clarify. But it does sound pretty unique, the approach you've had with that, and even just some politics coming down here in the interior with some folks I know. It's a super unique approach that you guys were able to take to actually like basically have that traditional governance system running while this really weird colonial structure is running. So that's awesome.
Yeah, it's funny because you got to ask the hard question of what do we actually want as a nation? And if we want to return to our traditions, how badly do we want that? And are we willing to give up modern power structures to achieve that? And our answer was yes.
And from what you've seen too, like when you're talking about those modern power structures and giving it up, was it challenging to perhaps have existed in this structure that had been implemented however many years ago and then be like, nope, we're getting rid of that and going this route? Like, what did that look like?
Totally. I mean, while I was young, there was a lot of struggle for our village, where I think there's conflict. I know there was conflict because I remember it between hereditary and council and the greater population and hereditary. And as these sort of speed bumps were happening, there was a lot of lateral violence in the community before people got used to the idea of what it would be like, where they think they there's all kinds of assumptions, whether the council is crooked and they're going to do something, or hereditary chiefs are crooked. And like, I think the oppression and the anger and all this stuff that happens in communities, it really can come out in negative ways, as we all probably know. And so there are speed bumps like that, but right now it's going great. And I think one of the biggest, another huge step we had was we had one of our hereditary chiefs was also the elected chief, and it really brought the two together.
That's super interesting. Thank you for sharing that and letting me just drill you with these questions. I'm like, deep
Yeah.
questions, let's do it. Um, So, shifting back onto the original track of this conversation, can you explain to our listeners a little bit about how Indigenous relationships with ecology are so closely tied to Indigenous health?
Yeah, totally. So, as I mentioned, this is becoming my jam more and more because these conversations are the ones that allow me to continue to be a harvester and do what I love out on the land. So, when I just try to think of this as an anthropologist, but also as just a community member, it becomes very apparent that the way we talk, the way we laugh, the way we make sense of spirituality, the way we govern ourselves, all those things, the way we understand what it means to be a good human in all aspects. I would say quadrants of life, uh, they're so deeply derived from or influenced from the land. Like the land made our language, the land made our spirituality, the land gave us our governance systems through non-human species, through the spiritual world and the spiritual aspects and entities on the land, or just living in those geographies and how they influenced us. And so when I think of that, that's kind of like my starting place is when I realized that working with my elders, it was a total epiphany that the longer we're disconnected from this, the longer we're disconnected from our language, the longer we're disconnected from our spirituality, the longer we're disconnected from our own laws. And so really my passion became about reconnecting with land, and whether that was me telling stories about it or taking youth out or presenting in the local school. That's really where my passion has become. And to further that, as I dive deeper in my research, and as you alluded to, that I'm kind of working on this book, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit, often in our culture, it's the non-human world that kind of lays out this path that says, here are how you guys are supposed to move forward as humans. Here are the treaties and the laws you have with each of us in this ecosystem web. And when we live in that way, we can thrive, because there's many stories in our culture of us not living in a good way and failing. And so I also really lean on those stories to say, hey, let's not get on that path again, because I think we are, with the state we're in, with a world of excess and consumerism and all the ways that we're living now. And so, one, this relationship with land is widely recognized as a determinant of health for our people. But two, I really want to dispel this idea that humans are like this cancer on the environment. Like, I feel like I heard that all the time. And I don't know whether it was just conversations in pubs with goofballs or like people just genuinely saying that humans are bad and we're screwed and all this stuff. And I kind of refuse to believe that. What I believe is that if we're grounded enough and living in a good way, we have this beautiful ingenuity as humans to live with our ecosystems. But we got to believe we're a part of that ecosystem first. And our laws really lay that out and tell us how we are a part of it. And so that's the sort of twofold, is like, this is how these relationships are great for us as community members, whether it's how we eat or how we engage in spiritual practice, or there's these lessons for greater society too. And so that's where my research comes in today. That's my excitement on land-based relationships with land and how it can make us better people.
That's a really refreshing perspective, I'd say, because yeah, a lot of the conversation I think you hear online with, those kind of fear posts where they're like, oh my gosh, like climate change, we're running out of resources. So yeah, there's a huge narrative too. I would say I didn't hear cancer as much, but that we're parasites, right? Like that's what I get. So it's such a unique perspective to actually be like, well, we should look at ourselves living with our ecosystems, and part of that. Yeah, sorry, that's just very mind-blowing. It's very different than the narrative I hear out there.
I'm
So
glad it resonated.
it did, because honestly, that's a lot of what I hear out here. And I would be lying if I said I didn't have anxiety about our current state of relationships with the land and what's happening right now, right?
Totally.
And it's all over the internet all the time. And I think there are a lot of people, how do I say this? It sounds like your perspective, like it gives hope to it and optimism versus people who are just like exactly what you said. They're like, we're screwed, we've killed the earth, there's no going back type narrative.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that's really the sort of um, toxic idea that can spread in politics, where it's like, climate change is going to play its course, so let's just keep industrializing these healthy ecosystems. Let's keep harvesting, let's keep extracting, as opposed to saying, you know what, let's just step back and say, what do we need and where can we go so that this will sustain us? And we do have the power of mind and emotion to make those good decisions. And I just believe in human ingenuity on some level.
I love that. And I think you're right, going into this extremist mode of like, oh, well, like not much we can do. We might as well kind of keep doing what we're doing. I think it's like a free pass. It lets people let go of that accountability, right? Because people as individuals are like, well, what can we do? There's no point. Whereas looking at that different point, we're all members of this ecosystem and truly we can make that impact. That's kind of how I interpret that. And I think it's really good because, I'm sorry to get off topic, everyone, but this is relevant, especially with the wildfire seasons we've had recently. A lot of people have reached out, and there have been articles about it, about this anxiety people have towards climate change and what's going on. And I know anecdotally, like quite a few people I know struggled with their mental health during that. It was really hard. But I think actually having this type of perspective, right? Again, it's almost also empowering. So yeah, you have to take accountability, but it's empowering, right? Because it gives hope. And I think for me, at least, like I perceive it to be like real, genuine hope, not just like sprinkle rainbows on things and hopefully people feel better.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, there's this thing people are talking about today in academia called ecological grief. And I think it's the
Okay.
anxiety and the fear and the sadness that comes with climate change, and in the context of Indigenous communities, like, where do we go? And something I've sort of been saying for years is that, well, if we look to our stories, we've experienced this before. And this isn't to diminish it, and this isn't to become pacifists, to keep harvesting in the way that we do and keep treating the land in the way that we do. But if we can look to these stories where we have overcome insane ecological destruction or change from our own culture, and in our case, we have our stories about the land being covered in ice and wild sea level change that we had to survive, and it was hard, but we did it because we had this human ingenuity, we had resilience, and we had this sort of spiritual connection to the land where we would lean into it and talk with it through ceremony, through different facets. And so if we can kind of reconnect in that way, maybe that'll be one of the solutions.
Well, thank you again for sharing that. I love your perspective on that. I'm like, I feel like the listeners will be like, wow, that's a really great point. Or at least I'll go away from this conversation and be like, wow, I am now settled inside.
Right.
Personal thing. So talking about that, so is this kind of how you finished off with your PhD work and where you're going with your postdoc work? Like, is that where this is coming in? And do you want to talk a little bit more about what you're hoping to do with the research you're doing and what the overall goal is and how you hope to benefit individuals and communities?
Totally. Yeah. So the PhD research, which I think I just said it was interdisciplinary, really what it was the elders started in my community started asking us to do research of a sacred watershed that was on the route of these proposed LNG tankers, proposed oil tankers. And they said, for the time being, just research what you can, because the sacred watershed happens to be where a whole bunch of these elders were born and raised. And so it's a very fluent sort of lifestyle that they were raised in, for lack of a better word, fluent in that they were born in the smokehouses, in the longhouses. They were, like my grandpa talks about, paddling these cedar dugout canoes and sleeping in them, camping in them, harvesting out of them, living out of them, and back and forth to these big longhouses that were still there. And they remember this. And it was kind of a regular part of life up until the 50s and 60s. I think the last child born there was sometime in the 50s. And so because we're also remote, like that's still quite amazing that kids were being born in the longhouses in the 50s still in this area. But all that to say, they wanted to preserve this place. And so maybe through research, there was this hope it could become protected. And that's where they sort of sent myself, Nancy Turner, and Dana Lepovsky, and my supervisor. So now Dana Lepovsky and I have been managing this project since, I don't know, 2015 or something, on this sacred watershed. And my PhD became how to tell the story of this place. And so a part of that was pairing oral histories with archaeology. And through the archaeology, we were able to map out sea level change of the watershed and how village sites were at one point so many meters above sea level than they are today. And again, how that plays into the story of resilience and ecological change thousands of years ago, and how 14,000 years ago, sea level was 90 meters higher or something like that. And this wild story that pairs well with our oral histories. Another part of it was looking at place names and language used in that watershed and how that brings us ecological knowledge and identity. And the final piece was, what was land relationship and stewardship look like with this place? And that's where my passion really grew around, okay, if we're going to not only protect this place, but use this place as a story to help other people connect with ecosystems, what do we talk about? And I think that's where we talk about millennia of relationship and stewardship and stories that come from this place, which is now turning into a postdoc of mine where I want to write a book on the different relationships I have as a harvester with each species I harvest sort of in our territory. I'll have to limit it to somewhere between 4 and 8 species. I'm not sure. I know for sure I have like 5 or 6 picked out already. And how each of these lessons sort of say a similar thing, and that's, in order to be in good relationship with these sites, with these places, with these ecosystems, we need to be in deep commitment and communication and awareness with each species we're vulnerable to or rely on. And in this postdoc, my hope is to use each chapter of my book as my own relationship with an individual species. And so, for example, one of them is going to be mountain goats. And so I'll talk about, what is our origin story of mountain goats? What was our first relationship with them? And through these stories, what were the laws that they gave us? What were the treaties they gave us with them moving forward in order to be allowed to harvest them, in order to be tied to them in a way? And then the next chapter will be another species, and then another species, whether it's going to be salmon and halibut. I'm going to talk about seals and anything that I love to harvest. And so that's how it plays into it. And I'm hoping that each story I'll also tell not only these oral histories and lessons and laws that have teachings for modern society, but I'm also going to try to tell my own stories of, you know, cool tidbits. Like when I talk about harvesting wolves, I'm going to tell a story about getting chased by a pack of wolves. That sort of stuff that happens while you're out in the bush.
There's a great chance that like by the end of this, when we're done recording, I will be like, so Spencer, please tell me this story about being chased by a pack of wolves. Like actually. Okay, so this is crazy cool because I did not know that this is what you were doing for the book. Like I had heard about the book, stuff through BC Near. So that's so exciting. And what's really cool about this, I keep using the word cool, but that's just where we're going today. I just sat down with an elder from the territory I'm in, and that was 2 weeks ago. And this is something really important that is coming up in different ways. And for her, more talking about plant medicines, but she's actually asking people in the territory not to harvest like they normally would because there is this issue with sustainability. And two, with access in post-sec to now there's like herbalist courses and people are shifting into alternative medicine. She and some people in her community are noticing these territories or regions, I should say, where specific plant medicines are, they're being over harvested or incorrectly harvested. And a big shift of what she's talking about too is wanting to connect with local herbalists and people collecting plant medicine to talk about that relationship and what that relationship is supposed to look like, supposed to, I say with air quotes, and the stories behind it, exactly that, because what you're talking about is really important. And I'll try not to go on too much of a tangent, but yeah, like just how those stories in that relationship, like it's in a sense, like reciprocal relationship, right? Like you need to be putting into these spaces, and I'd say these species before just assuming you can take from them. So that's really exciting to hear. Are you going to be dealing with any plant medicines? Or are you talking about like animal wildlife that you harvest typically?
Yeah, I'll be talking about wildlife, and I feel like there's a lot of books right now around plants. And so I just want to do my own spin on it, even though there's lots of stories around plants too in our territory. I've also sort of been playing with this conversation a lot because for the last few years I've been trying to reach out to the non-Indigenous hunting world as well. And I feel like I'm hoping that whether a person is a harvester or not of animals or fish, that they still be interested in the lessons that these stories have. And one of the big lessons I think that comes out all the time when I'm asked by the non-Indigenous hunter who is trying to be thoughtful and careful, and they say, well, what do? I don't know what to do. I live in Vancouver, there's no wildlife, but I want to eat wild game. I live in on Vancouver Island and I have access to areas to hunt, but I don't know, like it's not my territory. What do I even do? And outside of creating relationships with Indigenous communities and understanding and feeling like a member of the community, whether the larger community of any small town where you have good relationships with the Indigenous community and you can trade food or help out or do things like that. Outside of that, there's this relationship with the non-human world that we have to think about. And I feel like the motto, or not the motto, just the status quo for the non-Indigenous world is we can just go where the wealth is. We can go to that wealth, take it, and then leave, and it's okay because we're taxpayers of British Columbia, because we're citizens. And that's just a fundamentally flawed way of thinking in my mind, but also fundamentally different than how we see relationships with land, where you don't take from that land unless you're giving in some way. And so when people ask that, I often encourage, I don't want you to come up to Hartley Bay and start using these stories that I talk about to hunt in my territory. I honestly don't want you hunting in my territory. But what I want you to do is lean into your own backyard and get to know it and become intimate with it. So when things go haywire, when there's, people are over harvesting, when industry is running amok, you can stand up and say, hey, no, I'm going to fight for this ecosystem, or I'm going to fight for the people in the local Indigenous people who really depend on this ecosystem. or just having that idea that this is the place that I should give back to. And it should be in my backyard, and I don't have to travel to a foreign place, like drive up to northern BC once a year to harvest elk and then come back and never even know anyone from there. To me, that's really disrespectful and frustrating.
I think this is great because it sets up for one of the things I was going to bring up. So you recently presented with us for BC Near and some graduate students, and it was really fun to see you again because I haven't seen you for a while. I don't think I saw you since maybe GER. Hey, it's been a while. Um, and in your presentation, you actually mentioned that your end goal of all of this, these bajillion, I'm going to say, years of being in post-sec, getting all of this education, was not to jump into this job of being, in academia, as this big researcher or this tenure track or tenured professor at an institution. You actually were talking about how you want to be able to use this to give back to your community. And this was both refreshing to hear, but I also think a super different perspective than what I think I'm used to hearing, right? Like obviously people are like, oh, I want to give back to my community, but to not actually be like, I'm going to jump in there and this is my job and I'm going to be up there as a top researcher, get a Canada chair or something like that. Do you want to expand on that a bit and even reshare the story you told us about that?
Yeah. I I mean, the first thought that comes to mind is that, as you mentioned, some people have no hope for the environment, and they're like, it's just gonna, let's just keep on doing what we're doing because climate change, we're going to hell in a handbasket anyways. That's almost my approach with universities. So it's like, I mean, maybe I'm just a crotchety old man and I need to be corrected on this, but here's my thought. Specifically, when it comes to studying land systems and land system knowledge, I think there's a time and a place for Indigenous knowledge to be in the university. And that time and the place is to share stories and knowledge that can influence society for the better. But the conundrum that we face is that academia, it's an ivory tower. It's like it's not accessible to mainstream society. And so it's kind of like we pretend that we're changing the world, but I took a year to write this paper, and who's actually reading that paper? And how much money went into that research? And is it actually is this the best use of our time? And at some point I decided this is not the best use of my time. And so I'm over it. And I just genuinely, when you go into these roles, the way I sort of understand it, and this is another generalization of mine that could be ripped apart, but if I were to go into a job, it would kind of be like, as a professor, you would do 30% research, 30% teaching, 30% university-like stuff, whether you're mentoring grad students or sitting on committees and being involved in the university. Well, that leaves very little time for my own community and the ecosystem that the knowledge that I carry comes from. And so in my research, I will be talking about and writing about this idea of when we are talking about Indigenous knowledge and ecosystems, every story that I study or have heard kind of lays out this relationship. Like we should be as intimately tied to these landscapes as we are to a partner we marry. And if we look at it this way, how much sense does it make for us to go hang out on and do field work for 2 to 3 weeks of the year and come back and talk about that and write about it as if we're the expert on this place for the other 11 months of the year? It's almost as if we go and we have a marriage with a partner and we hang out with them for 3 weeks, and then the rest of the year we disappear and we pretend that relationship is intimate and fulfilling and thriving and all this stuff, but it isn't. And so who am I as an ecological knowledge holder or traditional knowledge holder to only be spending a few weeks of the year in my territory? How could I make that claim? How am I living up to this? And so in my mind, my time is better spent is being in the territory and sharing those stories of being in the territory. And until academia can create that space fully, I don't know if there's a place for me in academia aside from where I'm at right now, where my PhD and my postdoc is going to allow me to tell this story. And so really, for the university, they have to balance this sort of like want of, um, they're very hungry for Indigenous knowledge, and they're very hungry for this idea of decolonization and all that it entails. And so I think there's this knee-jerk reaction that's just like, let's harvest as much Indigenous knowledge as we can right now. And for me, what it honestly just feels like in my gut is that there's this insatiable appetite that I will never fulfill. And it's about quantity over quality. And if Spencer goes and writes something in an academic journal or presents something, I really don't know how much it resonates. I don't know how much it moves people. But if I feel like if I write a book that's accessible or create a short little film of me harvesting and talking that's super accessible, I know that there's this sort of quality behind it that will transcend not my only my academic community, but other communities. And that's the flaw I see in academia. And until that is really addressed, I'm really conflicted on how much I should be involved.
Well, thank you for your honesty there. And I think the question that comes up to me, or maybe kind of that obvious thing, and I find this with some of the work I do and some of the experiences that I've had, is this idea of decolonizing or trying to do decolonial work within colonial systems, right? It's an interesting kind of scale because there is that craving, and it's what you're saying, like it seems like this insatiable hunger for that Indigenous knowledge, and we want to decolonize and support Indigenous students, but we're also requiring them to do this in a very colonial institution under colonial guidelines, with these very specific expectations. So I think that's great. And what do you want to do when you're done your book? Are you going to keep working with your community and researching? What are you going to do? What's the idea right now? I know that could change in a heartbeat, but
Yeah, totally. I'm glad you recognize that it could change minute to minute, and who knows. But yeah, to back up, it's like if I truly want to live a decolonized lifestyle or want to live an Indigenous way, it's just much more attainable and actually more realistic if I'm not in a university stuck in a city. But I also want to recognize like there are these beautiful urban Indigenous communities that can exist where, the first time I remember going to UBC, I was shown the sweat lodge on campus and how there's Cree elders and Anishinaabe elders like holding these sacred roles. And that's amazing and beautiful. And that's the nuance of this conversation that I'm kind of skipping over. But for me, I'm not sure how much is attainable. And I worry that if academia invites this sort of shallow existence of knowledge in their institution, they're going to produce shallow faculty and staff that don't really care. And so they're okay with learning everything from books, but then at the end of the day, don't really want to be a part of an Indigenous community. And that's what I worry about. And I'm not pointing fingers at anyone, and I don't even have anyone in my mind I'm thinking about when I say this, but that's a concern of mine. So it feels like the only real place I know that's secure where I can live this is in my own community or in a community. And so my hunch is that hopefully I can write this book and be out on the territory as much as I can and do real stuff in my mind, real in air quotes in my mind, like when I can, taking the youth out to hunt, when I can, showing them the rituals that come with our hunting, the spiritual rituals, the lessons, the teachings, because that's a political act in itself. That's an influential act in my mind. And once the book is done and I've been able to do that sort of thing, I'll probably just end up in politics again. I don't know. We'll see if I get another way to write another story, but maybe do both. I think even though my passion is here, there's this neat part of leadership where you're challenged. You're always challenged to work in different spaces. And part of that challenge is learning how to grow and be flexible and like just have a deep sacred responsibility of being in leadership of people. For some people like myself, it's quite fulfilling. And so if the community wants me to get back in politics, I would totally do it. But we'll see.
As an Indigenous scholar, and we've kind of talked about that interesting framework of academe and how it is as it is, do you and have you felt supported in this work up to now? If yes, how? If no, do you want to, if you're comfortable with it, talk about some obstacles? And then adding to that, your PhD supervisors, how have they responded to you being like, nope, I'm not going to just jump into trying to be a professor and seek tenure, etc.?
I'm glad you bring this up because, on one hand, I feel like more supported than I would have ever expected because Indigenous knowledge is so hip right now in academia and in the institution. And whether it's shallow or not, I think we'll find out in years to come. But regardless, my PhD was essentially fully funded, one full year by NEAR and other years by SFU, by amazing scholarships like the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, like amazing as in, I mean, a lot of money, more money than I saw. Sure, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I recently am finishing up with Minister of Environment and UBC Okanagan and UBC Around Together for Wildlife is its name. All these sort resources that have been amazing and helped me do what I've done. And that's huge. And I feel so privileged in that. But also, I think there's just this give and take where if you are entering that world in academia, you recognize you're losing a lot of the things you might feel pulled to do. And in my case, it was really struggling on what to do with things like, how do I make it home to Hartley Bay for every memorial for Prince Rupert, for every potlatch, for these roles that I felt like I had, or my elders would ask me to come and be the master of ceremonies or be the MC at a funeral or be these things that are really sacred and honestly are things I would remember for the rest of my life and say, I'm very glad that I was the MC for this elder's memorial potlatch and things that I won't get back. And that has been hard and confusing. And I'm glad you mentioned my supervisors because my supervisor, I don't actually know her full list of past students. I know a handful. But when she got me as a student, she said, this is going to be a learning experience for both of us because I just simply don't know how to proceed with someone like you, someone who is, well, at the time on council, holding cultural roles, doing all these things, but also genuinely takes these roles seriously. Where your average student gets to go to the university, their job is to write their thesis, and that's high on their priority list. And for me, it really isn't high on my priority list. In the day-to-day, my priority list is knowing that my elders are okay, knowing that I can eat the food that I've harvested, knowing that I'm staying on top of my community roles. And then down at the bottom of my list is my responsibility to the institution, the academic institution. And that was confusing and hard. But also I want to honor these bodies, these entities that are funding my work. And so a lot of soul searching throughout the PhD, really. And knowing that at the end of the day, I can't point a finger at anyone or thing saying, you're the reason why I can't go back to my community. Like that power is within me to just leave. But also knowing that the institution as a whole is so young when it comes to this dynamic of reconciliation and decolonization that they're just flying by the seat of their pants trying to do what they do. And so they're bound to mess up and screw up and not know what to do. And when you get a researcher that's willing to say anything that's on their mind, like me, who is also happens to be well funded and has these ties to community, I think in my case and in my experience, is a new experience for a lot of people, from my supervisor to the dean to my colleagues. Like it was just unique. And I think that's happening more and more, where you get Indigenous people in these positions where we're well funded, we're well connected to our community, and we really aren't kissing the university's ass to get a job. We're just in, like, we just want to be who we are meant to be, and that takes priority over a tenured position.
So for your master's and then a bunch of your PhD, so were you required to spend a lot of time more than desired out of community then, like having to be more so at the institution? And do you think if that's what happened, were you able to find kind of a balance, or at least enough of a balance between your community obligations and responsibilities and your academic? And again, that balance being like enough where you were like, okay, like I can settle with this amount here and this amount here, like it was able to work for you?
I think I'm just learning that now, and this is year 6. And I mean, for most of it, no. And I think, I mean, on a practical level, this is what it looks like. Is my that first semester, I was flying up to Prince Rupert and then to Hartley Bay every other weekend, and then going to Victoria for meetings with the government while being based out of SFU so I could do my coursework, and also flying into UNBC to tie up my master's thesis. And it just, like, for the first few years, I was, like, honestly really sickly and exhausted. And I remember being physically sick all the time because of that stress and that chaos. And as a part of my supervisor's commitment to being on this learning journey with me, she, like, took it upon herself to kind of micromanage me in a way, which has been helpful at most of the time, but also insanity at other times, because you have a supervisor picking apart your work but also micromanaging your life. But bless her soul that she did this. And over time, you were in a presentation I just did the other day to grad students where I said I was able to develop this mantra where I had to ask myself, if it's not an F yes, it's an F no. Where every decision I made was, is every part of my body telling me to do this? And if so, I'll do it. But when it comes to all the little tasks, all the little things, whether you're asked to sit on a committee or do a guest lecture or do all these extra things that academia asks of you, if you have one sort of a hint of hesitancy, then yeah, being on the fence, then it's no, it's an F no. You don't go there, don't entertain it. And sometimes you end up saying no to a lot of potentially fun, cool stuff. But that's been the only way to make it through this, and I'm finally learning that now. And the same goes for my community. You know, there's lots of amazing stuff that I'd love to do. Partnerships, collaborations on research, on, just doing amazing cultural camp style stuff with kids, and the stuff I want to do. What I know right now, I really got to finish this thesis. And so it goes both ways.
If you want to answer this, you can. If you don't, that's okay. It's a little deeper than I usually go. How do you feel about everything you've done and where you're at on this journey? Because I can relate in that, yeah, I remember I went back to school just undergrad with a baby, like brand new baby by myself. And I was sick so much. I was so tired. And so it's good that you brought that up, because I'm going to ask you, I was like, how are you not exhausted? And you're like, I was tired and run down from the stress. Where are you now? Almost if you look at like undergrad, master's, finishing up PhD, after all of that, how are you feeling where you're at on this journey you've been on?
Honestly, I've kind of been pinching myself since November or December, because it's the first time in a decade where I was like, you know what, I like life right now. And that's just being brutally honest, is that if I look back the last decade, most of the time I didn't like life. And it was just because of the stress, whether it was politics and fighting, billion-dollar corporations and being worried about the land, and trying to, like, juggle life along with that, and all the ups and downs. But I mean, that's just me, and other people have other experiences. But finally, I think it's knowing myself and what I can take on, being secure, more secure than I've ever been. And yeah, it's hard. Like, it can be hard, especially when, a lot of our people are struggling, and a lot of us come from backgrounds with immense trauma and oppression and all kinds of stuff that influence you on this journey. And so right now, life is great. And I'm in a great position to move forward and work on this next part of the journey, which is doing my postdoc supported by NEAR at the University of Victoria. But it's kind of been a hell of a ride.
I can only imagine. And are you feeling, I don't know, it kind of sounds, maybe I'm misinterpreting it. It sounds like you have excitement about the postdoc. Like that
Oh,
seems more fun, creative than, like just, you know what I mean? Like less rigid in the structures of like master's, PhD. This seems more of like a fun, exciting component of your journey.
totally. And I think it allows for me to slow down and reflect, which is, I think we all need. I know when I last look at the last handful of years, like throughout the PhD and a few years before, a part of the frustration and struggle with life was just not being allowed to slow down and just be human and being tied to insane amounts of meetings and just being a piece of all the things I listed, whether it was fighting for our ecosystems or being in boardrooms that were depressing and all this other stuff, and then all the life drama that family drama, relationship drama, all these things that come up as a young person doing this shit. But now, yeah, I'm able to like envision a project that involves my favorite activity of being on the land, and I'm given the space where I can sit and reflect and slow down. And as long as I can create my own boundaries on what I say yes to, I have so much security and I'm at the helm of my own wheel here. And that feels great. And I'm very excited for the next however couple years or whatever it is for this postdoc.
That's super cool. And I'm excited for you. Like, I don't know, it's kind of, I don't know, it seems like from an outsider's view, like that full circle, like back on the land, doing your thing. I think a lot of this conversation has been really insightful. And I think for people who are considering entering academia, there's a lot of takeaways already. But is there any other advice you kind of want to leave for those listening, like young Indigenous future scholars, who are looking at a career in academia or who want to look more into Indigenous health and wellness and land-based research? Yeah, any advice for them who are thinking about jumping into this?
Yeah, I mean, I have a rush of thoughts sort of coming forward. And one of them is that both my master's and my PhD, I had this vision that I was going to do what I'm doing now with my postdoc, where I have the freedom to research with my people and tell stories. And realistically, it wasn't the case. 80% of my time was spent at the school, was spent, in my computer screen, in these places that I didn't necessarily want to be. And I don't know if this is just the sad case of being an adult, where when you take on a job or a project, like you vision this beautiful vision of it, but really it's like only a small piece of that is the vision. And so the question is the thing you want to research powerful enough? Are you passionate about that to be able to push through the 80% of the BS, the administrative stuff, the like actually sitting down, being at a computer all the time, the isolation, where you can't just be a normal person who leaves their work on Friday and can go on the weekend guilt-free and then clock back in on Monday, where it's just like sitting weighing on you, working for economically much less than most other people your age, potentially all these other factors. If your passion is strong enough that it can make all those other factors less scary, then it's worth it. There's a great amount of freedom, and in reality, this path has allowed me to reconnect, even with all those other factors I just mentioned. The fact that my job is to sit and think about my culture allows me to reconnect in a very special way. Where, let's say I go back to growing up in Burns Lake and being a school teacher in Burns Lake. Let's say I pursued that. Actually, my first goal was to go into the trades. I considered that. And so let's say I still had the same passion for my culture, but was in the trades. or was a high school teacher, like I imagined, my job wouldn't allow me to dive as deep as I have today. And that's special. And that's the beauty of what, on some level, academia can offer, is the freedom to do that. But it also comes with a beautiful responsibility now, where whenever there's a project in the community, I get called up. And sometimes it's like, holy shit, I just want a night off and not have to go in another Zoom meeting where I'm sitting on the board of, for example, building a new museum in Hartley Bay, or the reconciliation committee around looking at treaty and ensuring that cultural representation and all this stuff I've worked on is involved in our treaty and reconciliation process with the government. All these things you volunteer with, like, it's a beautiful special responsibility that comes with these roles. But also at the end of the day, it's all rooted in this wonderful thing, and that's like my territory, my people, where a job at a high school isn't really rooted in that. Whether if I went into the trades, like, my job wasn't rooted in that. And that's the fundamental difference.
Yeah. Similarly, I would just say, as much at times where I'm like, oh my gosh, the institution is exhausting and draining me. Yeah, I have had a very unique and, again, at times exhausting, but other times really exciting life. So there are unique opportunities in post-sec and all of that. So very insightful. I just want to sidebar on something because I realized you mentioned this earlier and I think I forgot to ask the question. So I don't know if I realize this, but are you considered, like, are you an anthropologist? Do you identify as an anthropologist? That's what you do?
Yeah, I think I tell people that most often because I tell stories about humans. I've dabbled in archaeology. And so I think people understand what an anthropologist might be,
Yeah.
because they think of Indiana Jones
Yes.
and stuff. And yeah. And so I think most often when I'm not in community, I'll say, on paper, I'm an anthropologist.
So with that, and you'd mentioned, right, there's not typically a ton of traditional or indigenous anthropologists, especially in the North. One of the first things I learned when I went up to UNBC was how damaging prior anthropologists had been with that really extractive come into community, do the research, take stuff out. Those stories you were talking about that some anthropologists had accessed from your community, was that a healthy interaction back then, do you know of? And knowing the history of, like, anthropologists in Indigenous communities and their super extractive typical procedures, what was that like for you? Was that a motivator for you to go into that type of work and become an anthropologist? Was it kind of wishy-washy? How did you feel about that?
I think at the time I was just so stoked to learn what I could about our culture. This seemed like the most holistic sort of lens, where it was like so broad. It was like, what do these humans do? That's the fundamental question, as opposed to how do we look at plants, or how do we look at strictly oral history? How do we look at strictly spirituality? So, like, let's look at everything. So that got me stoked. And then from there, I started putting the pieces together on what's healthy and what isn't. Yeah, there's this curious case amongst the Tsimshian where we have this rich history of anthropology, or what they call ethnography. And in the early 1900s, there was several key anthropologists in North America, Franz Boas being one of them, and Marius Barbeau being one of his students, who came to the Northwest Coast. And they had this sort of vision, this foresight, that we should just hire a hereditary chief who speaks the language to do all the interviews. And so they got this man named William Bainan, who was a hereditary chief of the Port Simpson people, the Loch Willam's people of the Tsimshian. And he did this amazing breadth of work where he tried to interview every lineage in of the Tsimshian nation, which consisted of, there's like 8 villages, which becomes 50 something different houses or clan lineages. And within that, there's like several hundred chiefs. And so his goal was to, like, map it all out, tell their stories, their territory, and all this stuff. And so that's all very inspiring considering it was the time of residential schools and all the crazy racist societal policies happening. And I think that's a success story of anthropology. But anthropology itself at the same time is embedded in this colonial process of collecting and sort of, what's the right word? It's like rewarding this idea that knowledge is static, and now that we've collected it, that's the truth. The Indians are kind of dying out, so let's get this, and this is going to be forever their truth, what we record today, as opposed to, I don't know, let's say now when we look at those ethnographies, if an elder says, well, actually, this isn't quite right how the oral history is. It goes like this, and it's a little different. If you were to bring that to the government would totally rely on the original anthropology texts. And so there's still this power dynamic where something done in the colonial institution of university and research in anthropology is given so much weight than the actual Indigenous people themselves. And so what I found, interestingly, how this all came together at one point, this is a little story that really sums this relationship up very well, where I was sitting in the room with both the government and one of the corporations who are proposing an LNG terminal, and they were spouting off to me where our territory was. And it was very interesting just to sit there and be like, oh, okay, this actually happens, where these people have never been to our territory are telling me what our territory is and how it looks and where we belong in it. And me actually being the person who also studied these anthropologies and ethnography texts that they're listing off and spouting off, it's just like, in no other room would I think any nation have, like, there was this privilege in that they didn't know that I studied all these texts too and could find the contradictions, but also studied in the hereditary system and was also on council and from the nation. And so they were walking into this room that they just didn't know they were walking into. And so it became this battle where it became, what is the literal interpretation of the anthropologies so we can decide what the Gitga'at First Nations harvesting rights are in traditional territory is versus what they tell us through their own reports, where we would hire a consultant. It turned into this back and forth judicial review, which I don't fully understand what it is, but it's kind of like a mini little legal battle that doesn't involve courts or anything, but a back and forth legal battle with the government, with the provincial government, where myself and a hired consultant named Richard Inglis was able to develop this report and successfully argue our representation of rights and title in our general area. And we actually won. And that was like, okay, this is where this beautiful collection of anthropology has actually shot ourselves in the foot because of how the government is interpreting it in such a black and white way and not seeing the gaps and not seeing all these other nuances that we lay out in the report that we produced. So long story short, I think that sort of sums up the dynamic of how these things can happen and how, whether it's government or a corporation or even elected band councils, can interpret or misinterpret anthropologies and early recordings of our people.
Yeah, that's a really important consideration. And I think, I mean, I've taken anthropology and I love it. I've taken a bunch actually. And I have a good friend who's an anthropologist, but just that reality of, yeah, how static these reports are considered and interpreted. And I currently live and exist on unceded territory that has multiple claims from multiple people, and a lot of the information using to support different claims are coming from prior anthropological evidence. And so it's just very interesting to hear that and think about the situation here on this territory, and how complicated it really is in terms of it not just being this little static, oh yeah, this was this and this was this. So thank you for that. As an organization, so us at BC Near, that strives to support scholars like yourself who are doing really cool and important work, what are some ways that funders and organizations again like BC Near can do to support your types of projects and passions? out there? Because there's, like you said, there's huge shift with decolonization. People are trying to fund like Indigenous students. They want them in academe. But what actually is beneficial and supportive?
So I don't know if I've made it clear already, but BC Near has funded 1 year of my PhD thesis and is now funding me for the first year of my postdoc. And I feel like the sort of vibe I've gotten from the organization that is great is that there's this general recognition or understanding, unspoken understanding that Indigenous research involves Indigenous people in their communities, in on their territories, and in whatever that community and territory looks like. And I don't think that is harnessed and understood in other places. Like I feel like a general university would just be like, oh, okay, Spencer knows enough that he could just teach here for his lifetime and live at the university and that'd be okay. And we'll pay him enough of a paycheck that he'll be happy. And in reality, that is so far from the case. And I think that's the beauty of the vibes that I got, for lack of a better word, because I'm still building this relationship and hope to pursue it further and be involved in BC Near. But when involving Indigenous students, that's just the huge part of it, is just understanding that huge portion of this is just allowing Indigenous people to live these lifestyles. And there's nuance in that as well. Like how do we know that people are being legitimate and they're engaging their communities and living these lifestyles? Like those are all questions that you learn via relationship with people and their work and hearing them out and stuff. And I mean, I think that's the case with any organization where you hire people, you work with them, it doesn't work out, but sometimes relationships thrive and all this stuff. And I think that's the dynamic that an organization funding Indigenous grad students, it's a great foundation. And so from here on out, it's just like trying things out and seeing what works with that understanding and knowing what at its core are we. I feel like there's these two criteria, I'm just spitballing here, that are wonderful, that I feel like Near can probably achieve and is doing already. Is one, is this person like legitimately connecting and producing Indigenous research, engaged in their community, ethical research? And two, is it adding to the general sort of space where we tell these stories, share this knowledge for the betterment of Indigenous people and society? And those are just the two broad criteria that I've really felt are honored moving forward.
Well, thank you for that. I'm just like, hello, funding partners and other organizations affiliated with the BC Near. Please listen to this section of the podcast for sure. No, that's great advice. And those are great considerations because I know for a fact, right? Like a lot of the traditional funding systems, they don't take that into consideration. So it's great. And thank you for the kind words about the BC Near. I'm like, wow, Spencer, that's so nice. I have stolen, well, not maybe you've gifted it to me, but a ton of your time today. So I will wrap it up. But is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to touch on, or yeah, you just want to bring up? I have time, but yeah.
I mean, I honestly think we talked about everything.
I
The
know we
only
talked a
other
lot.
place to go is like a deep dive into my death metal career. But I think that's like a whole nother bag.
I'm like, we could do
Maybe
an episode on that in the future if you want it.
or when I make it to the next Near conference, whenever
Yes,
I can, I'll tell that story. And yeah.
please do. Or I'll be like, Tara, when we are planning music, can we please get Mr. Greening and his previous heavy metal, death metal band to present for us? That will be our next call on you, Spencer.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Seriously, this was a great conversation. I feel like you've given our listeners a lot to think about. And that's it. This is Research Decolonized, brought to you by the BC Near. That's the British Columbia Network Environment for Indigenous Health Research. Thanks so much.